Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, a look at why federal funding is key to research efforts through the eyes of two Johns Hopkins researchers who've helped build mountains of data about genetic and environmental factors in autism. Stephanie Desmond talks to Christina Ladd-Acosta and Heather Volk about how they are on the precipice of making discoveries that can improve the lives of those with autism and how important NIH grants are to getting there. Let's listen.
Heather Volk and Christina Ladd-Acosta, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Stephanie. We're excited to be here today.
Thanks for having us, Stephanie.
Of course. And today I'd like to talk to you about the autism study that Johns Hopkins University is part of, that you two are leading. Chris, can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. The main goal of our study is really to understand how both genes and the environment come together to influence autism diagnostic symptoms, social communication and behaviors, other kinds of mental and physical health conditions as well that individuals with autism experience much more often than others. And when we're talking about environment, when I use that term, we're really talking about lots of different aspects of our lives, everything from the neighborhoods we live in and what the sort of green space or air quality might look like there, to chemical kinds of exposures or chemicals that are in our everyday kind of household products, to pregnancy conditions, and even diet and different nutrients that we take in every day.
Could you just quickly tell me a little bit about the autism landscape? How big the problem is and what is being done to try to solve it?
Sure, Stephanie. So most recently, data coming from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Autism and Developmental Disabilities and Monitoring Network tells us that 1 in 36 8-year-olds in the United States have a diagnosis of autism. This number has really increased over the course of my career from 1 in 110 as much as, 10 to 12 years ago. So we can know that more and more children have been diagnosed with autism. What does this mean in terms of severity and the conditions that are seen is a big question in the autism research community. And then where does this increase come from is one of the questions that we're hoping to understand in our study too.
I was going to ask what the big question here. What's the big goal here, Chris?
Yeah, so the big goal, with this idea of genes and environment come together, it's really to identify different environmental factors that we could potentially modify, right, or change to help reduce some of the challenges and these symptoms that people with autism face and really improve their outcomes in the long term and make sure they're able to achieve really their potential.
We know that autism is caused in some part, right, by genetics, by inherited factors that are in a person's DNA. But that doesn't explain the whole story of who gets autism or how severe their autism might be or what conditions might be more common in a person with an autism diagnosis. So we really hope that by studying genetics and the environment together, it can give us those clues as to how and when people might be most impacted.
Yeah, that's right. To give you maybe a concrete example, we have studies already and we know a lot about how genes and environment come together in humans. One example is called PKU, or phenylketonuria. This is actually a genetic condition where some individuals in our population and society have a gene that is defective in its ability to break down something called phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is just a kind of biologic material that's present in lots of different foods that we eat. And so individuals that have this change in the gene aren't able to break that down. And it builds up in the body and can cause seizures, intellectual disability, and many other health challenges. What we know is that despite having this genetic change, we can change the diet, right? Or what kinds of foods they eat to eliminate foods that are high in phenylalanine so that they don't experience any of these symptoms. It can be fully prevented despite having the gene, the symptoms, simply by changing the diet and the kinds of foods they're eating.
So tell me about your current study. It is funded by the National Institutes of Health. Talk us through what you've been working on and where you see it going.
Totally. So our current study leverages the infrastructure of 18 different studies from the US, Denmark, and Canada. So it's a big collaboration of research that has been invested in some ways, largely by federal funding here in the United States. And these 18 populations have typically not worked together. Our study seeks to build and has built really the infrastructure to pool data across these resources to let us analyze and understand how genes in the environment work together at a really large scale. So typically, where an epidemiologic study might include hundreds or thousands of people with autism, we will together have data on more than 175,000 individuals when all is said and done and our data is pooled. So that lets us really begin to understand some nuances, some exposures that might be more rare, how genes really work together across populations. Additionally, because we really want to also understand biology of how gene-environment interactions might work, we've partnered with individuals from the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering who really work to grow brain organoids or sort of cellular systems that let us control experimentally how given chemicals on genetic backgrounds might change brain function or some of the underlying biologic processes. And so those two things working together are really nice. That lets us get a handle on underlying biology that might be important, but also understand broader public health impacts of genes in the environment in relation to autism. The last cool thing that we've done as part of our study is worked with community advisory groups. So we've developed a community advisory board of people with autism, caregivers of people with autism, and even, a medical ethicist and people who help provide clinical care for people with autism to get their insights as to what the environment means to them and how and what conditions might be most impacted.
Chris?
And I'll just add, we learn so much from them as well, and how we as scientists even can be better communicators. How can we communicate what we're learning in these studies with those various groups so that we can all use it?
I'm curious about the NIH funding aspect. What happens if we see a reduction in federal funds, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Stephanie. As we've already mentioned, this network is really just possible, and we're really just starting, I feel like, as a field to explore genes and environment in combination, in large part because so much effort from the federal government and funding has been contributed over years. I think it would be really unfortunate if we had to stop this work now, after so much time and effort has gone into collecting all this data for decades, when we're finally ready to really kind of roll up our sleeves and get in there and do the analyses we want to do to better understand how environment shapes these outcomes.
It's also sort of novel in the case of this project in particular that our funding really comes as a product of the Autism Centers of Excellence, which is a particular grant mechanism funded by the NIH. And it comes from the Autism Cares Act, which is a particular act that has been passed by Congress that really seeks to cover autism prevalence monitoring, training of medical professionals to detect and diagnose autism, research on autism, surveillance on autism, and many programs and other grants that benefit people with autism. And the CARES Act has been around since 2006. And so this research mechanism that funds our big study has been part of this from the very beginning.
What happens if you lose it at this juncture, Chris?
Yeah, I think, we would not be able to really explore these questions and better understand and identify really environmental factors, right, or different things in our environment that we could modify and change to really improve people's health and outcomes in the long run.
This is really about improving people's lives, improving the lives of people who have autism, their family members, their caregivers. I also understand it's the largest gene environment interaction study in the world. Are other groups doing similar work with other diseases?
So, Stephanie, I think there have been really large consortia over the past 2 decades for genetics and trying to identify genetic influences on many different health outcomes. And those really have been the ones that have moved forward to date and having these really large networks and consortia of international partners to make that kind of work possible. There are not as many, right, studies that also have the environmental information that ours have collected, right? And so being able to partner both of those pieces of information instead of one or the other is really where the gaps have been in pushing this forward for lots of different health outcomes and mental health in particular. And so again, it's really unique, and we are really well positioned to leverage this wealth of rich environmental and genetic and outcome and symptom-based data to put it all together in this network. There really are very few other studies out there like it.
Yeah, I think I would just add, right, that we always look to other diseases in public health, and in particular because we study one that has been less, I think, studied from a public health approach. You know, if you think about large consortia that have made advances in understanding both causes and consequences and downstream health impacts, we always look to things like asthma or cancer. And there, Chris is totally right that those large genetic consortia has really come into play. With asthma, we've seen some advances around trying to look at things like air quality, right, or allergens in the environment in relationship to genetics. In cancer, you know, depending on the type you're looking at, right, folks have looked at family history and genetics in relationship to perhaps diet or smoking. And so in autism, we have not yet been really well powered and in the position to be able to have these big consortia in place to try to find these big impacts that can really impact public health. And that's the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do here.
Why are you now able to do this kind of work when it wasn't able to be done in the past, Chris?
So we're able to do it now really because so many resources have been developed and this data has been collected over the past 20 years, right? And we're able to bring that together through this funding mechanism and this Autism Center of Excellence to build the pipelines, to build the infrastructure for each of these sites to come together and for us to harmonize their data and be able to analyze it as a big consortia network.
Let's just talk about data in general. It feels like it's at the heart of everything that you all are doing, a lot of your colleagues are doing. And this data was made possible through, among other sources, the National Institutes of Health. Do you, Heather, have concerns about what these rumblings could mean in the future?
So, you know, so many of these studies have been supported by either the National Institute of Health or the Center for Disease Control and Prevention over time. And so whenever there are notices around potential cuts to funding or restrictions of data use, right, I think the scientific community always gets a little bit nervous that this incredible investment that exists, without which we can't answer some of these questions or even begin to address them, could potentially go away. It's also an incredible, almost a disservice to the families who have participated in some of these long-term follow-up studies. Folks have given so much time and effort. When we do an interview or questionnaire for many large consortia around, we're not talking about 10 minutes. We're talking about an hour-long or a day-long investment of person's time. They might also be willing to give DNA or other biosamples to a repository to try to maintain. And so, you know, it's an incredible investment in goodwill and in culture and broader investment in the scientific community and in public health by many people too, to create these, in addition to the scientific and the financial investments as well. So the other thing I would add, Stephanie, is that while Chris and I are driving this big consortia right in this network, it also provides the opportunity for so many future scientists to get involved in autism research and to really let us think about how to grow this area of research and how to begin to train and support the next generation of scientists. I can only speak for myself, but all the way back into my doctoral training, I was supported by NIH funding, and that I continued to be so throughout my whole career. And so without investments from the federal government in training scientists for the future, I wouldn't be doing the work that I am today. And it's sort of now, I think, our job to try to pay it forward and train the next generation of folks.
Yeah, and I think we're really fortunate in our network to have so many junior investigators and folks that are just starting their own labs and just starting their careers and are really eager to make a difference in the lives of people.
Christina Ladd-Acosta, Heather Volk, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, you.
Stephanie.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.